Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. If it's your first time visiting us with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we are all about bringing science, adventure, exploration, and conservation live into classrooms across North America and beyond. So now that the school year is in full swing, we are broadcasting 30, 40, even 50 live events a month to classrooms. So head on over to exploringbytheseat.com. You can find an incredible listing of events and find out how you can tune in or join in live via camera spots. So the month of September, we have been focusing on ocean plastics. We've been talking to scientists, explorers, filmmakers, artists around the world who are documenting the issue and bringing it live to the general public, researching to bring important health issues to light, as well as looking for innovative solutions to solve this global issue. So couldn't be more excited today to be welcoming David Rothschild to the program. He has explored some of the world's most remote and fragile regions in order to bring widespread media attention as well as solutions to urgent global environmental issues. In the summer of 2010, he embarked on the Plastiki, a one-of-a-kind 60-foot catamaran built from about 12,500 reclaimed plastic bottles and a unique recyclable technology called Seretex. The Plastiki set sail for an ocean adventure of 8,000 nautical miles across the Pacific and created a platform for conversations around fuel, conservation, as well as to try and shift public thinking and perception around plastics. So I'm going to bring David in live with us from the UK. David, it's so great to have you joining us today.
Thanks, Joe. It's awesome to be here with you. As always, you're always inspiring me to think about how to do more. So thanks for having me on the show.
All right, amazing. Well, this is a pretty exciting year. I think it's the 10th anniversary of the Plastiki.
It's true. 10 years ago. I'm aging myself. I was only 10 years old when I started the program. I'm just 20 now. Don't let the beard fool you. No, it was 10 years ago. And, it's interesting. What's exciting is that 10 years ago, there wasn't this kind of conversation happening. People weren't really maybe necessarily, I didn't say weren't thinking about the plastic issue, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is today. And so it's exciting to hear that there's a plastic week and there's some incredible speakers I've been following on your program that are, inspiring us all to think differently about how we kind of deal with this, what I would call toxic love affair with plastic.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, that's what gives hope, right? When you see people starting to pay attention, starting to change, make lifestyle choices. To see an issue like this brought to more of the forefront is pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we've if you look at where we've come from and where we are and where we should go, where we've come from is clearly one where maybe we weren't so aware of these what I call human fingerprints. Now we're really aware of the human fingerprints. I mean, we see them on a daily basis through some of the most tragic imagery, whether it's, washed up animals, marine life on beach full of plastic, or just the images. There's this iconic image, I think you used it, of a surfer, who's in a tube and it's just full of plastic in Indonesia somewhere. It's everywhere. So we've got this awareness. And now what do? Well, the good news is today we've got a ton of solutions, because with that awareness, obviously we need to do something about it. There needs to come action, I guess. And what gives me hope is that we do have the solutions to tackle this now. It's not a future thing. We can do this today. The big missing piece in the middle for a lot of us, and myself included, when I first started this conversation, was how do I begin? What do I do? What are the first steps? For me, it was building a boat made out of plastic bottles. And I thought I would share with you just a little bit of that presentation. I got a presentation where I'll share a little bit of that, sort of how it began all those years ago. Because I think all of us really have a Plastiki inside of us. Really what Plastiki stands for is, it really stands for the idea that anything is possible. The idea of working together, we can create some incredible solutions to the problems that we face. So that's really, for me, where through all this time of working in the plastic space, looking at it You know, objectively, it's overwhelming. It's sometimes very complex, like a lot of environmental issues. But with a team and a global community of people who are vested in our future, which there is, we can do amazing things.
All right. Well, David, on that note, I will let you take over for a little bit, and then we'll do some Q&A with our live classrooms.
Amazing. So I'm going to share my screen and pick up this. So let me just open up on this first slide. You should all be seeing my screen now. Shout if you're not. So I always love this quote. I think it's a quote that really sums me up pretty well. And if it's good enough for Albert Einstein, let's just say it's good enough for me. I really believe in curiosity and the power of curiosity. I think we're all born to explore. The challenge, you know, is remaining curious. And yep, that is me. My hairstyle is only marginally better today. It was pretty awesome there. So remaining curious, and that's something as adults, as we get older, we're often, you know, we forget that, and our egos get in the way, and we forget to explore and be curious and ask questions and challenge the status quo. So for me, I always think about everything through this lens of what I call the equation of curiosity. Dreams are the breeding grounds for adventures. Adventures generate stories, and stories inspire more dreams. But that whole process is pushed through by asking questions. So when you dream about something, like I dreamt about building a boat out of plastic bottles, the adventure suddenly begins, those stories start to percolate, and that is what inspires others to start thinking about some of the stories that we're generating and the adventures we're on, and dreaming bigger and dreaming about other ideas to change the way we live on this planet. So that's the equation of curiosity. When I started reading about the plastic issue back in 2006, it was really this obscure article I saw that talked about, it was actually a paragraph inside of a UN report on the high seas, and it talked about 46,000 items of plastic on or below every square mile of our ocean. And I started to really think about that statistic and that number, and I was sure it was a misprint. There was no way this could be right. And when I found out that actually it wasn't a misprint, and it was in fact the best guess, and that no one really knew, I started to think this is an area that needs my attention. There is so much plastic being produced, as we all know now, on a daily basis. And I think it's really important to make clear that plastic isn't necessarily the enemy. What is the problem is how we use it, how we dispose of it, and how we reuse it. We have got very used to what I call a disposable lifestyle. So some of the things that you see in here, like plastic straws or disposable cutlery or bags or earbuds or, you know, styrofoam cups, I would call them dumb uses of plastic. Those are the kind of plastics that we need to eliminate. We need to drastically change our relationship to them, because they are pushing these human fingerprints out into the ocean. But back in 2006, when I first started thinking about this, there wasn't a conversation. So I thought to myself, how can I make a conversation? I started researching, and I remember this image of this gentleman collecting these plastic bottles. And I thought, wow, what an incredible image. I could look at this and feel very sad, or I could look at this and feel optimistic. And I looked at this and was inspired. I thought, what happens if I was to take one of the most ubiquitous items, a plastic bottle, and build a boat? And then I was going to sail out to this area, which was at the time one of the only known areas, called the Eastern Garbage Patch, that Charles Moore and the Algalita Marine Research had highlighted. I was going to sail to this patch, this island, this garbage patch, on this boat of plastic bottles. And that was where this adventure began. And the first sketch I did, and I pulled up here back in 2007, it was, let's just say it was a little ambitious. As my friend said, what were you designing, a ferry? I like the little sleeping arrangement. There's a few people stuck, I think, on the side there in their bags. But we did put in, you know, some fun ideas into the sail. We said we would have a sail made entirely of plastic bottles. We were going to be propelled, as you can see in the bottom right there, by dolphins who were going to push us along and help us on our journey. But I think I was a little bit, maybe say, ambitious. So we started, as I said, with this equation of curiosity. Can I build a boat entirely of plastic bottles? The moment this drawing was done, the adventure began. And that's where I started to ask people for help. Hey, do you know how to build a boat? If you don't, that's not a problem, because I want everybody's input, no matter who you are. And we went off to a bunch of different people all over the world, different experts, asking this very simple question of, could we build a boat entirely of plastic bottles? And the bottles had to be visible and they had to be functioning. And we started to look, and one of the best places to look is nature. So the pomegranate actually became one of the main symbols of how we would pack the bottles together inside of the hull. And the other one was this very interesting way we looked at in Asia. When eggs are carried, they take the eggs, they pack them there. You can see in the middle, they pack them together and then use this other structure around the outside, which is bamboo generally, or a reed, and it's twisted and they're all held together safely so they don't move around. And we really looked at these two as sort of inspiration. Say the bottle itself was highly engineered. As an individual item, it was quite malleable. You could crush it, you could, lose it and damage it. But if you pack them all together, you could end up with these structures that actually gave you a lot of rigidity. How we got there was clearly going to be a challenge. When we first started trying to line the bottles up, we started introducing all of these different elements like wood and wire, and we started to realize that our structure was just going to twist dramatically like a piece of licorice. And I remember sitting down with a friend of mine who said, one of the greatest rules of environmentalism is doing more with less, which is obviously a famous quote from Buckminster Fuller, which I'll come on to. But it really did sort of like hit me in the head of like, how do we make this project have a story, something that people would be interested in? So our first sort of leap was to actually see, could we float a design? Could we actually make a design work? And we went to a naval architect who basically said to us, you need to be using a catamaran. This is a traditional vessel that would be floating in the South Pacific and across the Pacific, these Pacific outriggers. So you need to build something that is used to dealing with those types of waves, that type of movement on the ocean. So this was actually a prototype that we built to see if our design, a mini prototype, would actually work. And actually about, I would say, 30 seconds after this photograph was taken, the front mast there, which looks very stable, actually fell and nearly hit me on the head, knocking me out. So I thought that was, it was definitely a lot of bravado when it comes to it. But one of the big breakthroughs for us was the material. And this was really a material story. Plastic, as I said, is one of the things that every day we see a ton of it. And a lot of it is really only used once. So that cycle of designing, making, distributing, to then use very briefly, often maybe only for minutes or seconds before it is disposed of, doesn't seem to make sense. So throughout the project, we were constantly trying to figure out how we would make a vessel entirely of plastic bottles. And so we had to segregate out the structure and the buoyancy. And so the buoyancy was made entirely from all the bottles that we collected out of the waste stream up in the top there. You can see that massive pile. It was 12,500 of them. And then the actual structure that held those bottles in place, we also wanted to make out of plastic and PET, the same structure. So we actually found a company that was playing around with some PET fabric, you can see in the top left there. And we actually figured out a way in which we could sandwich it together to make these boards, like in the bottom left image there. So we could actually start to create a structure. And this was me in one of the design sessions with Andy, designer on the left there, our boat designer, me probably sort of saying to him, do you think this will work? Him looking at it, sort of going, yeah, I'm sure it will. And Nick on the other side, probably with his head down, thinking, I'm not entirely sure this is all going to work. It took us 4 years, from 2006, really, when we started the conversation, that first drawing 2007, all the way through with a lot of trial and error. I always say R&D is one of the greatest things you can do. Do the research, and then you end up obviously with the development. But I would say develop first, and then you get the research. And again, you find out what it is when you find out what it isn't. This really was a team effort. There was a lot of us involved in this project. This was the sort of the skeleton of the actual Plastiki as we started to design it and develop it and build it in Pier 31 in San Francisco back in 2010. This was quite late stage, but this skeleton structure that you're looking at here was what really held all the bottles in place. And that was really a breakthrough for us, was to be able to use this PET material. So that structure you're looking at there, that sort of skeleton, is 100% made of the same materials as the plastic bottle. that we're seeing ending up in our ocean. So after all that time, this was the boat being lifted, and you can see underneath now all of those bottles packed in tightly into the underside of that catamaran to give it shape back to that original pomegranate image. It was very, very close to that sort of biomimicry, nature-inspired design. We did a traditional Polynesian blessing. This day was actually quite auspicious because there had been a huge tsunami registered off the coast of Chile that day, based on an earthquake that had happened around 8, I think it was 8.2, and it had sent this tsunami. So it was a tsunami warning, but you can see people turned out for the blessing. It was very important for us to pay homage to those who've come before us and the original navigators of the ocean. And there's no one better to really do that than the Polynesians, who really are the sort of, the fathers of the ocean. So off we set on this voyage. This was in March on the spring equinox, right out under the Golden Gate Bridge. And I remember thinking to myself, what are you doing? I remember thinking, I really hope that all those people who said that this would not work are wrong. But I had great faith in the crew, the people who had designed it, the people who had helped me build it. And it was a real team effort. And I think by this point, we were all so excited and so amped up and ready to go. And you might notice how the main sail with the Plastiki is a darker color. That was back to that original drawing where we said we would like to make it out of reclaimed bottles. That entire sail was made for us specifically using reclaimed PET from the waste stream that we put into that sail structure. So off we set underneath the Golden Gate Bridge with the bottles exposed. There they were, allowing the water which would run through. Each one of these bottles was inflated under pressure to give us buoyancy. Life at sea began. There was a crew of 6, and we would spend, days bobbing around, really not going anywhere on what I call braft in the end, a combination of a bottle and a raft, sending comms back up in the right there. You can see we had this little desk where we would send updates to our team. It was before social media really took hold. So we only had Twitter and a little bit of Facebook to get some instant responses back from people on land about what we should be doing or asking us questions. A lot of time playing games, tending to the garden that you can see me there on the bottom right-hand side, which we had on board. But really, when you travel in the ocean, you realize just how vast this planet ocean is. Our planet is entirely covered almost in water, of which we, owe everything, I should say, because it really is the sort of source of life. It's where we swam from and where we evolved from. It's where we get every second breath from. It is truly a real honor to spend time on the ocean. As, I think any sailor or anyone who spent time in the ocean will attest to, you are at the mercy of nature, and you really are grateful to her when she gives you a smooth day. Like these days here, we had to jump in and check that our bottles were not leaking. We had to make sure that our structure was still intact. And you can see on the top right and on the top left and even on the bottom one, where you start to see the sort of barnacles and all these creatures, and this life starts to form in and around all the bottles. So we'd often go under there and realize that we were transporting all these characters with us on this incredible journey. We made a stop or two along the way. This was one of our stops actually in Samoa, where we had to make some repairs before our final leg. But I always loved this shot because you could really get a sense of, generating our own food on the back there with the garden, the solar panels on the roof, which we had to design specifically to fit that shape. But this was a boat that was going purely, on its own steam. There was no engine. We had a tiny outboard motor if we needed to turn around to grab someone, but that really wasn't enough to do anything more than just nudge us into a direction where we could try and hopefully go back and find someone if someone was to fall over. You can see on the back there as well the 2 wind turbines that generated all the power along with the solar that we needed to communicate via our Inmarsat satellite. We were a crew of 6. We had rotating crew members come in and out, very long nights, shifts that I would wake up and be half asleep, fill myself full of coffee, and then roll out onto the deck and then suddenly be enveloped by the stars and the ocean and these incredible sort of, I don't know, almost otherworldly experiences where you would look out and really feel that you were this tiny little star floating on the ocean. And sometimes you couldn't understand if you were on the sky or if you were floating on the ocean because they blended into each other. There was a magic in the ocean. So we spent, really about 100 odd days at sea with a few stops in between. Our longest leg at sea was the first crossing to the Line Islands, which took us just shy of 50 days without seeing land. I'm someone who gets incredibly seasick. What I never really anticipated was how sick I would get when I got off the vessel as well. Huge swells. Everyone always asks, were there storms? Yes, there were storms. But again, we were privileged and lucky that nature gave us a pass to travel through safely. We did hit some of the biggest storms right towards the end of the voyage, where we were all sort of, I guess, a lot more familiar with how the Plastiki would operate, which was very lucky. But we were very lucky to get out of those storms because they weren't really forecasted and they hit us pretty hard. So I always laugh. This was kind of probably missing a few wiggles. We did go from San Francisco to the Line Islands, from the Line Islands to Samoa, Samoa to New Caledonia, and New Caledonia eventually into Sydney, which I think was the last stop. It definitely was the last stop. And this was us arriving. And I remember this moment and feeling overwhelmed by what had just undertaken. The journey had been a symbol of sort of this adventure that we had been part of. But I really knew that what was lying ahead was this global conversation of plastics. This was the time that we needed to start having heightened awareness. We needed to start thinking about how we were going to tackle the problem. So I remember everyone saying, what do you think? How was it? And I remember thinking to myself, and I think I even said it, you know, someone said, is this a success? And I said, we won't know if this is a success. And, you know, until many years later. And only then, when we start to really tackle some of these issues, will we know if it is a success. And to me, you know, we were very fortunate. We got, you know, the accolades. Everyone said, well done. You know, we were Time Magazine Innovation of the Year. But going back to what I said earlier, really, this was about doing more with less. This was about looking at material. This was about teamwork. This was about anything is possible. And do more with less is one of the mantras that I still use today, often when thinking about the plastics issue. When you look at where we are today with our plastic disposable mugs and forks and all of the bottles and bags that we use on a daily basis, doing more with less is as simple as replacing those items with reusable items such as these. The reusable cups, the reusable cutlery, the reusable bottles, the reusable bags, all of those things is doing more with less. And all of the time, every moment that we challenge ourselves to think curious, we can continue to be explorers. So I'm going to sort of leave it at that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope that all of you have enjoyed that. And I'm now going to let Joe jump back in, but that's a little taste. I left a few things out so that hopefully you can stimulate some questions. That gives you the Plastiki in 15 minutes.
All right. Amazing, David. Thank you so much. What, you know, what an epic journey to look back on. I'm sure countless conversations, you know, have been sparked from it. And I love how you call it, you know, it's a Plastiki moment. Anybody can have it. A big idea, a thought, a challenge, changing your, you know, a part of your lifestyle can all be Plastiki moments.
Yeah, I think we all have a Plastiki moment. I think the issues that we face today sometimes can feel really overwhelming. I know I feel overwhelmed. And, you know, I have to remind myself that those everyday actions that we can take, no matter how small they are, contribute to taking the right path. And that's what we need to do. We need to sort of let go of the way we've done things. So I always say learning is super important, but also sometimes unlearning, especially for us adults, letting go of ideas and allowing new ways to come in. And, you know, 10 years ago, we weren't talking about plastics so much. Now we're talking about it. And not only are we talking about it, we're seeing incredible young activists and educators and people all around the world starting to create their own Plastiki moments.
All right. Well, let's bring in our first classroom here. We're going to Ontario with Mr. Candela's group of grade 7s joining us. How are we doing, grade 7s?
Good.
Yeah, grade 7.
Grade 7 in Kingston, Ontario.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Did you enjoy that? Any questions?
Does anybody have a question? I'm sorry, can you say your question and then I'll repeat it?
My question is, how much money and influence did it take to get like experts helping you, or like, how much time and research did it take? Like, what things did you have to do to get the knowledge to do what you did?
So the question one of my students is asking is, how did you get to the point where you had that knowledge to do what you did?
Great. Yeah, I think
This is a live feed.
Yeah. So yeah, it was. It's always tricky, you know, to get any program underway. I think what served me in this project was actually not knowing a great deal, because I think had I known a lot more about sailing and a lot more about building, a lot more about dealing with unconventional materials, I think I probably would have scared myself into maybe not doing it. So I think the idea sometimes that you have to be full of experience and knowledge to try and start something doesn't necessarily, you know, play true. Sometimes you just have to have a passion, you have to have a commitment, and you have to have a good network of people around you who can support you in terms of understanding the areas where you need help, and being open to getting that help is really important. So I think it's really hard even today to get projects off the ground. You know, you have to just work tirelessly. You have to present ideas to people. Sometimes they get them, sometimes they don't, but never lose faith in yourself, because at the end of the day, you have to believe in yourself to dream big, because if you can dream big and you can do things for others, then the cycle repeats itself and others will be dreaming about you and doing big things for you.
All right, let's bring in our grade 7/8 from Tuscaloosa. How are we doing today?
Good.
Hi, Miss Foster's class.
Hello, say hi. All right, now it's your question.
Do you have any other plans to create something sustainable out of plastic?
It's a really good question. You know, I'm constantly learning and understanding the material. I definitely think, you know, there is a chance for us to do way more with the material. I'm seeing this new space really emerging. It sounds quite complicated, but it's called the circular economy. I like to just call it, you know, closed loop design, or cradle to cradle, which was something that Bill McDonough wrote a book on years ago, which is this idea that really the plastic should become the nutrient or the food for another product. In other words, when we design, we shouldn't be designing for disposability. We should be designing for next life. And so for me, when I'm looking at projects that we're working on, I'm constantly thinking about new materials and what they could become. So recently, I've been working on a mobility project, which is trying to, you know, build another experimental sort of craft. And one of the things we've been looking at actually is discarded fishing nets. So there's a ton of fishing nets that are ending up, you know, being dumped in our ocean, and they're made of number 7, which is nylon, which is a very robust. Sadly, for a lot of the fish, what happens is these nets drift around the ocean, called drift nets, ghost nets, and they end up actually causing more damage because they're actually catching fish in these nets that are just being left there by fishermen. So what we want to try and do is get these fish nets out and reuse them and start to think about what we can use them for. So we've done some projects with the nets before. We actually built some surf fins. There's a campaign we created called Fin for Fin, which is trying to stop you know, this sort of finning that goes on and marine mammals which get caught in these fish nets. And then we're also looking at a mobility project where we might actually end up using the fish nets and compressing them and pressing them into a board material that would maybe give us some structural material that we could use in a future project. Okay,
that sounds very cool. We've got a question here via YouTube from Annabelle, and Annabelle's wondering about the time the journey took, the traveling from San Francisco to Sydney.
So the whole voyage took around 4 months. We left in March 23rd and we arrived in July. We arrived July 25th. So it was a long time. It was a long time to be at sea. I mean, I think a traditional crossing, from what I understand, I mean, there is no such thing as a typical crossing, because obviously, you know, the weather and the boats and the size of the boats and the vessel, all these things can change things up. But, you know, if you think, it's usually probably around 2.5 months. So we were probably about double the time at sea. So it was a long time, but actually when I think back now, I would love to be back out at sea. The more time I could spend on the ocean, surrounded by Mother Nature, the better.
Okay, we're going to head over to India now. We've got Akash joining us live. How you doing today, Akash?
Hi, Cash.
Good. Hi. Okay, I'll directly jump into the question. Okay, my question is: do you think the goal which led to Plastiki expedition has been accomplished or yet to be accomplished?
I missed the first part. Sorry, could you repeat it? Do I believe?
Okay, I'll repeat. Do you think the goal which led to the Plastiki expedition has been accomplished or yet to be accomplished?
Okay, I think, Akash, are you asking, do you think the goals that he was hoping to accomplish are completed, or is there still a lot more to go?
Huh.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. So I think that we're really taking baby steps, right? So I think this is probably the I don't think the plastic conversation is anywhere near where it should be. I think we're taking some good steps, but I would love to see some leadership, and I'd love to see some legislation, because we can legislate really quickly around some of the most damaging plastics, like the plastic bag, like plastic, styrofoam, cutlery, and disposable ware. A lot of that could be legislated against, and we would find alternatives. So I think for me, I would say that I don't feel satisfied. I think when we stop seeing millions of pieces of plastic ending up in the natural environment, then we could start to say, hey, we're actually having a positive impact. We have to stay positive about moving things forward, but we really need to find some bold and brave leadership. I'd love to see some of our politicians maybe try and buck the trend, do something unique, get out there and sign some legislation that will actually eradicate these single-use plastics, which aren't just damaging nature. Because everyone always thinks, well, it's just a problem that's in the ocean. It's a problem that affects all of us, right? And it's I know, for example, there was I think it was in Mumbai, there was some legislation which I saw, which was driven by the monsoons and the rains. All the plastic was blocking the drains, causing more flooding than necessary. And I think it was the mayor who decided to ban plastic, this was many years ago, bags, for exactly that purpose, so that there wasn't this problem of flooding. So I think we have to look at it not just as a singular problem that might affect one part of the world or one animal or one species. It's something that affects all of us. And whichever way we get to finding solutions, I'm all for it.
All right, good stuff. We have some high schoolers hanging out in Peterborough, Ontario, youth leadership group. Let me bring them in with Mr. Douglas. How are we doing today, boys and girls?
Hi, everyone.
Hi. My question was, I just wanted to know how you funded the project, whether it be, going from San Francisco to Sydney or also building the boat. I was wondering
how did we fund the project?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the project was funded through foundations, through sponsorship. So often what we do is, I have a foundation, which is called the Voice for Nature Foundation. So we'll go out and we'll put together proposals. Generally, it's for big brands. When we were doing the Plastiki, we had IWC, which was a watch company. We had Hewlett-Packard, Nike, Kiehl's, and a few other brands that sort of, really at the time, I have to hand it to them, came on board to this very experimental conversation and project. And what we were saying to them was like, look, you need to change your packaging. You need to reduce the amount of plastic that you're putting into your supply chain, or, take, plastic out of your products. And we were having these conversations very early on with them. And a lot of the brands actually said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and design something. So we're going to redesign our packaging all out of recycled material, or we're going to eliminate some of these ingredients in some of our cosmetics that will have an adverse effect on nature because of plastic beads and various other things. So a lot of the funding comes from brands, sponsors. And now, again, when we do projects, we're looking to things like Kickstarter and other places to try and raise funds.
Okay, well, we're going to take a trip to the prairies now, out to where I was born, out in Saskatchewan. We've got Thomas, a grade 8 student, hanging out from home. So Thomas, I'm going to bring you in. How you doing, Thomas?
How are you?
All right, we can hear you, bud. Do you have a question?
Did your boat ever come really, really close to flipping or breaking in the big storms?
It's a great question. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, we had definitely a number of moments, especially I think there was that image I showed at the end with the big kind of waves where we had huge swells. Because we didn't have an engine, we would get caught in these massive troughs. And so we would end up, having to we would just try and keep our nose pointed down, but these huge waves, and they would come in and they would pick you up. And I was always convinced this is going to be the one that's going to flip me over. And it would go under and we would roll down. But, there was a real fear that we were going to end up getting flipped upside down. We'd had to engineer for that. So we engineered our sail and our mast, or rather our mast, I should say. So in case we did flip upside down, I don't know how we would have ever got it back right again. I don't think we would have. I think we would have had to sat on it and called for help. But it was definitely a few moments where I was very, very aware that there could be this impending disaster. But luckily, we got away with it.
All right, going to grab another YouTube question here. Eva is wondering, there's so much information out there. We know a lot of the facts, more than 8 million tons of plastic entering the oceans each year. What do you think is still stopping some people from, making some lifestyle changes?
I think what happens is we read an article, we see the imagery, we know that there's a problem, and often we're sort of, I would, to phrase this correctly, I think we're told, that as an individual, we can, we need to take these individual choices, I should say, on a daily basis, and that will stop this problem. And then we keep on seeing more and more plastic ending up in our environment, and it becomes a bit disheartening and discouraging. And so what I think starts to happen is it's quite convenient for a lot of these big businesses to keep on making disposable plastics. I mean, you've got to think about what's happening right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic where everything now is becoming around sanitization. We're trying to protect ourselves, rightly so. But with that comes a huge step backwards. We've got so many disposable items now reappearing. So the winners so far in this horrible situation we are with this global pandemic is the plastic companies, because they're making things now. They're trying to push things forward where, we've got all these disposable masks and gloves. We've got a ton of all the produce that we buy on a daily basis is being wrapped in plastics. And people might say, well, we need to do that to protect ourselves. And you're right. But do we need to wrap it in plastics? There's a lot of alternatives out there now that are less harmful on the environment, leave a less footprint. So we could be, if we have to wrap stuff to keep it safe and clean and sanitized, we could be using, bio-based materials. There's a huge wealth of bio-based materials now on the market that we could be using. Now, they come with their own challenges. But I would say what happens is I know that sometimes I forget my reusable bag. Sometimes I go and I want to buy some berries, but they're sitting inside of a plastic container. And then you feel this huge sense of guilt. So I think we have to look at trying to edit out and put pressure on the manufacturers to stop giving us too many disposable plastics choices, right? We've got to just remove it and replace them. And we've got to try and put that pressure back onto the companies that aren't listening to that and say, look, we're not going to shop here anymore until you change that. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the big retailers will change when we stop, buying products from them. So we have to try and reimagine a little bit, but we also have to put pressure onto the individual companies and packagers who are using non-bio-based, using old methodologies and putting a lot of plastic into the environment unnecessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. We, our wallets have a lot of power in what we choose to do when we open them. So,
and it's complex. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I think it's a really complex situation. Clearly, we've moved into, just take Amazon, for example, right? I mean, not to single out any retailer, but, you might order something and it arrives in a box with plastic wrapping and and it's a battery you've ordered, and, you think about the billions of boxes that are being shipped around the world. So we need to start looking at that and saying, hey, is there an option on checkout where we might be able to get less packaging? I'll take that option.
Yeah. I want to give a couple quick shout outs here. Julia from Ottawa, Canada is saying, hey, Mick is joining us from Thailand. So great to have you joining in. Let's go back to Mrs. Foster's class in Tuscaloosa and see if they have another question.
Does the heat from the sun have any type of impact on the plastic, such as melting?
It's actually it's a really good question. So what happened, the way the boat was, we had these huge, long, the catamaran had two hulls, 60 feet in length. And what we noticed is that during the day, the hulls were starting to bend up, right? And we noticed that our mast was getting loose. So we were trying to keep it still by tightening what's called the forestays, these bits of metal. And as we were doing that, we noticed that it was just bending and bending like a banana. And then at nighttime, it would get really tight because as the day it cooled down, it heat up in the day, and at night it would cool and it would start to drop again back down. It's a really bad example, but it would drop down and it's flat now. And we would see that almost the deck pegs which held the stays in were about to pop out. So we had this like contraction going on every day. And we were actually worried at one point that we might end up snapping the deck of our hulls. And that was a real problem. And so the heat was a huge problem for us, especially when we were near the equator around the tropics. Good question. And you don't think about that when you're designing it. You don't think, oh, you know, it's going to get really bendy because of the heat. So we just designed it and off we went. And, you know, when we tested it, we'd only done our testing up in San Francisco in the Bay where it's cold. So we never had an issue. But as soon as we get into the tropics and it's above 100 degrees sometimes, especially in the cabin, everything became super soft. So it was a real challenge to not only steer a boat with all these bottles, but this thing was bending. So it was like a big rubber boat, like a rubber raft.
All right. Those things you can only learn once you're in the field on expedition, and then that kind of flexibility and
you got to be flexible with it. You got to go with it. You don't have much choice.
All right. All right. Our youth leadership and sustainability group in Peterborough. Do you guys have another question?
Yeah. I was wondering how COVID-19 has impacted your research.
How it's impacted my research?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm sort of slightly fortunate in as much as a lot of the work that I do is telling stories and, you know, really trying to create creative ways to give nature a voice. So for me, in some ways, I've actually been able to do, you know, surprisingly more than I thought in terms of telling stories. There's new platforms like Joe and Explore by the Seat of Your Pants that allow me to tell my story and to bring new narratives to different audiences. I think for a lot of the friends that I work with and a lot of my colleagues and peers and people in my in the environmental space, I think it's been really, really tricky. I think a lot of people are losing funding for their research because there's clearly a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen with the economy. And rather than saying, let's double down and bail out, you know, and give money to scientists, we're bailing out businesses a lot of the time that don't necessarily serve society. We say that the businesses are too big to fail, but surely society and nature is too big to fail. So surely we should be putting money into that. And I think for a lot of researchers, I mean, we work with researchers in the plastic space. It's been very disruptive because you can't go out into the field and you can't pick up data points that you should be getting on a regular basis, which makes a lot of the data, gives you some anomalies. So I think it's tricky. I think for me, you know, the fact that there are tools now and I can sit still at home and still have these stories is definitely going to change the way that I look at education and telling my stories.
All right. Still one more question here from YouTube. Some 7th and 8th graders are wondering, where did Plastiki get its name?
So there is an incredible voyage that was in 1947. It was called the Kon-Tiki. And this was an expedition that was created really by the leadership of one guy called Thor Heyerdahl. And Heyerdahl was a very kind of interesting man who had been living in the South Pacific and was looking at the trade winds and looking at the direction of the waves. And he made this statement, which was that he thought that it was very possible that the Polynesian islands could have been populated from South America. And so he wanted to prove this. And he went off, this is, you know, really a sort of a daring voyage, I should say, where he cut down these big balsa wood logs and he set off from Cusco in Peru. And he sailed all the way across to Rangiora, which was one of the Pacific Islands, and he bumped into the reef there. But he had proved, you know, with still some skepticism, but he'd sort of shown that you could just drift across the Pacific, going from west to east. And that was kind of countering this other, you know, sort of theory that was saying that it was coming more from the north, from Asia down. He was saying it could have easily been that the Polynesian islands were populated from South America. So when I was designing this project and thinking about it, I had to try and think about what would make a great name. And the Kon-Tiki was so iconic, and we were going to try and drift across the Pacific, but this time in pursuit of plastic and raising consciousness and awareness and thinking about it. So all of a sudden, Kon-Tiki became Plastiki. And then it stuck because it really elicited a great name, a great response from a lot of people who read that story. It was remade into a film not long ago, but back in 1947, when they returned in 1951, they actually won Best Oscar. It's a great documentary if you ever want to watch it. And we were very fortunate that Olav Heyerdahl, who was the grandson of Thor Heyerdahl, was actually part of our crew, which really kind of was a sort of an icing on the cake, because it was not only was he a great friend and pal and someone I enjoyed, being at sea with, but it was a real nod to this idea that we were paying homage to where we've been. And now today we're doing it slightly differently, because I think you have to look back and understand where we've been to figure out where we're going to go.
All right. Well, David, the last thing I want to talk about today is, the legacy of Plastiki lives on. There may be some activities coming up. Where should people follow along?
So for the 10th anniversary, this year we were meant to be doing a tour all around the UK. The vessel has just arrived just arrived a few months ago, but it's also in lockdown right now. So we rebuilt the website. We put a lot of the content and all the archive photography back up on site, up on site. So we've got this brilliant new storytelling component of the Plastiki website. So you can go there. And then next year, on the 7th of June, we're going to, if all things are going ahead in the world, we're going to sail her all the way around the UK on the river systems, because as we move from Plastiki, we're moving it really to river tiki. And the idea being that the rivers are the arteries to our oceans. When people ask me, where does all this plastic come from? Well, the majority of this plastic is coming from river systems around the world. So if we can stop it in the river systems, we can then obviously stop it getting into the ocean. So we're going to do a tour of the UK. And then the plan would be to try and take her all the way through the river systems of Europe, maybe across the Seine or the Rhone and all the different places, maybe through Asia. Again, it's one of these sort of visions that hopefully people will buy into, and we'll be able to bring it to local communities, schools, universities all throughout the world, really trying to continue this conversation and drive individuals to take action.
All right. So I want to start off with a huge shout out to all the classrooms who joined us via Facebook, via YouTube. Thanks for the great questions. Thanks for our live classrooms from all over the place. Thank you for joining us and firing off some of those awesome questions. And David, of course, a huge thank you to you for taking a little time to join us today as we, September, we look at ocean plastics and we look at not only, the impacts they're having around the world, but some of those stories of, hope and this, like you said, the solutions are there, but a lot of it is about putting that knowledge out there and telling those stories and maybe having people look at plastic as not so much the enemy, but something we can use.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you to all the classrooms around the world who tuned into this. And I would say that we have everything in our capability to sculpt a new future. We just need to believe in each other, work hard on enacting those solutions today. So thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hopefully you'll find your own Plastikis, and I'll be reading and cheering about them from wherever we're at.
All right. Well, to everybody who's tuning in about 10 minutes, we're going live from the banks of the Agui River in Gabon. So hopefully you can join us with Joe Cutler. Stay tuned on this channel. David, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to catch up.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Joe.
All right. Thanks, everyone.